felt that he should be carried off by the music in spite of himself. But he would make at least one more effort to save his little friend. "Gretchen!" he cried, holding out his hands. She smiled, half sadly, and shook her head. "Gretchen!" he cried once more. "Come!" There was no answer. The music had suddenly stopped. The peeper with the children had vanished, and, while Fred looked, the little maiden with the soft eyes and tender, wistful smile faded out of his sight. The glow had gone, too, with the birds and the flowers. There was no longer any battlemented castle in the distance. It was the shade of the forest, and Fred was all alone. Tom Osgood, meanwhile, had trudged his scarcely less weary way along the road around the foot of the mountain, and about 7 o'clock had reached the city gate. Not that there was any gate, that had been gone for generations, but there was an old stone archway overgrown with ivy, in and out of which the birds fluttered, and under which Tom had to walk to enter the city. Just before reaching it, he stopped for a moment and looked down into the river that flowed swiftly below the city walls. The sight struck a chord of recollection. "What was it I used to read about this place?" he asked himself. "Seems to me it was in a piece I spoke once at school." He waited a minute, but memory made no response. Then, picking up his satchel, he pushed on into the town. To his surprise, when he had reached the hotel where they had agreed to meet, Fred was not there, nor had anything been heard of him. The portier assured Tom that the road was perfectly plain and nothing could have happened, but this did not altogether relieve him, and it was with a good deal of anxiety, having ordered supper, that he sat down to wait. His suspense, however, did not last long. In 15 minutes the door opened, and Fred came in. That something had happened, Tom guessed at once. There was a strange look of excitement on Fred's face, and his step was more active, Tom thought, than a boy's ought to be who had just walked over the Koppenberg. "Feel my pulse, won't you, Tom?" he cried nervously, throwing down his satchel, "and see if I got a fever. Did I seem out of my head when I left you? Did I talk wild, Tom? Did you ever hear of insanity in my family? Really and truly, Tom, I don't know whether I'm crazy or not." Tom was gazing at his friend in speechless astonishment. "What in the world's got into you?" he gasped. "It didn't get into me. I got into it, and it was a lunatic asylum, as near as I could make out, only the keeper looked like a clown in a circus and the rest were all children. I tried to get one of them away, Tom." Fred's voice broke a little. "But just then the whole thing vanished, just like people do in a dream, you know. I don't know where she went. I could see the spot where she stood, but she wasn't there." "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" interrupted Tom. "Dreaming?" indignantly. "Do I generally dream in daylight? Would I stop to dream when I was in such a hurry to get here ahead of you? And besides, Tom, I can whistle the march the man played. Just listen." Fred was a good whistler, and never had to hear a tune more than once to remember it perfectly. Now his excitement lent strength and clearness to his notes, so that anyone might have taken them for those of the peeper himself. So loud and clear were they indeed that the portier was drawn by them from his desk, the Oberkellner from the dining room, the director from the office, and most of the guests from the reading and smoking rooms. In fact, before Fred was through, he had quite an audience, most of whom, he noticed, had a puzzled, inquiring look on their faces, as though something about the whistle or the tune were out of the way. What the look meant he did not have to wait long to find out. "You whistle very well, sir," the director remarked, almost before Fred was fairly through. "But perhaps you are not aware that the tune is forbidden in Hameln." Fred was surprised and a little frightened. "Why?" he stammered. "I only learned it today." "Not from anyone in Hameln?" "No, I don't suppose it was. He was on the other side of the mountain." The director shook his head sagaciously. "It is not allowed in Hameln," he repeated. "I wouldn't whistle it again if I were you." "But why not?" demanded Fred. "Why can't a man whistle what he likes?" "For the same reason," gravely, that it is forbidden to play music of any kind in the Bungenstrasse. Fred stared. "What is the Bungenstrasse?" he asked, "and why may not one play in it?" "Do not the young Herren know the story?" The young Herren did not know the story, or if they did, had forgotten it. "Is there a story?" cried Tom. "Tell it to us, won't you, Herr Director?" The director bowed gravely. "Probably the young Herren will recall it, for one of their English poets has written about it. It happened nearly 600 years ago that the town of Hamel was overrun with rats." That was enough. Tom had found his clue. "Of course I've read it," he cried. "That was what I've been trying to remember all day. Hamelin town's in Brunswick, by famous Hanover City. The river Weser, deep and wide, washes its wall on the southern side. Don't you recollect, Fred? They couldn't get rid of them, and one day an old fellow came into town and offered to pipe them out for $1,000 or whatever it was, and they took him up. But when he had done it, and the rats were all drowned in the river, they wouldn't stick to the bargain, and so he struck up his pipe again, and this time all the children followed him." "Why? What's the matter, Fred?" "The young gentleman is ill," exclaimed the portier, and would have rushed off for a doctor had not Fred interfered. "No, no," impatiently. "I'm not sick, Tom, but don't you see? Is it so?" Turning to the director. "Is that the story?" The director nodded. He was flattered by their interest. And besides, nothing that an American did ever surprised him. "Evidently the young gentleman has read it," he said. "All the children in town followed him as far as the mountainside, and then, when their fathers and mothers thought they could go no further, the mountain opened and they were all swallowed up. All, that is, but one little boy who was dumb, and another who was lame. This was the street they went down. On the Rattenfangenhause, opposite is a tablet commemorating the event, and ever since that time there has been no music played in the Bungenstrasse. Even if a bridal procession goes through the street, the music must not play, and the tune which you were whistling was the tune the piper played. It was scored at the time by the Kapellmeister, and everyone in Hameln knows it, just as one knows the Wacht am Rhein, but no one may play it, or whistle it, or sing it on the streets. Of course, if the young gentleman had known it was forbidden, he would not have whistled it." "Of course not," said Fred abstractedly. "Where's the house with the inscription on it? Can we see it?" "Certainly," said the director. "It is not yet too dark. The house is yonder, on the corner of the Osterstrasse." By this time Tom was burning with curiosity, and longing for a chance to speak with Fred alone. "Come along," he cried. "Let's go over to the old place and look at it." Fred was not unwilling, and tired and hungry though they were, both boys rushed out of the hall across the Platz. The hotel people interchanged smiles and shrugs. The Oberkellner went back to the dining room, the portier to his desk, the director to his office, and the guests to their rooms. "Americans!" one said to the other, quite as though that dismissed the subject. In the few minutes which it took to cross the square, Fred gave his friend all the particulars of the story which in his excitement he had not before supplied, and for lack of which Tom had not been able until now to obtain a clear idea of what had happened. "Then your idea is," he said soberly, when Fred had finished, "that those were the children who were lost?" Fred nodded gravely. "I suppose they must have been," he said. "And that the man was the Piper of Hameln?" Fred nodded as before. By this time they were in front of the house, and had discovered the inscription, which was written in queer old characters, once gilded, but now so weather-beaten as to be scarcely legible. "What in the world does it say?" asked Tom. Fred scanned it as closely as he could in the fading light. "It's hard to tell," he said. "Part of it is Latin and part German." but it's badly spelled, and there's some of it that must be Dutch. As near as I can make out, it reads like this. Anno 1284, am Tage Johannes et Pauli, war der 26. Juni durch einen Pieper mit orange Farbe bekleidet gewesen, 130 Kinder verliedet binnen Hamel, Cabon to Kelf Arrière, Bieden Kopen verloren. What gibberish? Tom exclaimed. Do you suppose you could translate it? Fred looked uncertain, but began word by word, as one construes a Latin lesson in school. Anno 1284, in the year 1284, Dage Johannes et Pauli, on the day of St. John and St. Paul, war der 26. Juni, which was the 26th of June, this very day, Tom, a piper with allerlei Farbe bekleidet. That must be party-colored clothes. Led 130 children born in Hamel by the Koppenberg to Calvary. That means to their death, I suppose. Tom nodded, and for a moment the boys looked at one another without speaking. Well, what are you going to do about it? Asked Tom at length. With another look at the tablet, Fred turned towards the hotel. There's nothing to be done about it, he said. I don't think I had better tell anybody here. Tom deliberated a minute. No, I don't think you had, he said. It happened 595 years ago. There aren't any of their relatives alive, and nobody would believe you anyhow. Besides, they seemed to be having a good time, didn't they? Fred's thoughtful gaze was turned down the street toward the mountain, where so many years ago the little feet had pattered to their grave. But was it to their grave? He wondered if instead of dying, they had not lived all that time, and whether anyone else had ever seen them besides himself. He was so absorbed, indeed, that he did not hear Tom's question until it was repeated. Oh, did you speak? He asked. Yes, I suppose they were. She said so. Well, I'm glad of that. I always felt sorry for the poor little beggars, and wondered if they got out of the other side of the hill. It's a great relief, Fred, to think of their having a good time. The piper couldn't have been a bad sort of fellow. As it turned out, Fred, you might say as the little lame boy, it must have been his sister, by the way you spoke to, did in the poem. The music stopped and I stood still and found myself outside the hill, left alone against my will, to go now limping as before and never hear of that country more. Fred drew a long breath of relief as he brought his thoughts back from the mountain. Well, he said, I'm glad I know who they were. I couldn't bear to think of their being lunatics. And if Gretchen and the two little girls had been as happy as all the rest, I should have thought. What would you have thought? Fred hesitated an instant. That I was getting a little glimpse into heaven. But then, it couldn't be that, you know. Tom shook his head wisely. Oh, no, he said. Of course it couldn't be that. End of section 7.